The German invasion of Poland in September 1939 marked the beginning of World War II and introduced a new style of warfare that shocked the world: Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. It was not a single invention or secret weapon, but a revolutionary method of combat that combined speed, coordination, and psychological pressure to destroy an enemy before it could react. The concept centered on deep strategic penetration by fast-moving, concentrated forces to disrupt command, control, and logistics. On the early morning of September 1, 1939, German forces executed this doctrine with chilling precision. Ground forces crossed the Polish border from the north, west, and south. Simultaneously, the Luftwaffe launched devastating attacks on airfields, destroying most of the Polish Air Force on the ground within 48 hours. Rail hubs, bridges, communication centers, and even cities were bombed to cripple mobilization and sow panic. This was not merely an aerial support operation. It was a strategic paralysis campaign. The goal was to blind and deafen the Polish command, creating a fog of war so thick that coherent defense became impossible. German ground forces were organized into integrated, combined arms spearheads. Armored divisions, panzer divisions, equipped with Panzer I and II tanks, and more formidably with Panzer IIIs and IVs, formed the tip of the spear. They did not operate in isolation. They advanced with direct support from motorized infantry, mobile artillery, combat engineers, and crucially, dedicated close air support from dive bombers like the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka. These Stukas, with their screaming sirens, became a psychological weapon, delivering pinpoint strikes ahead of the armored columns. Once a breakthrough was achieved, these mechanized units raced deep into the Polish rear, encircling entire armies, bypassing fortified positions, and leaving isolated strongpoints to be mopped up by following infantry divisions. This created a cascading collapse, as Polish units found themselves cut off, outflanked, and constantly outmaneuvered, fostering the demoralizing sense that the enemy was everywhere at once. The Polish military, though courageous and determined, was structurally unprepared for this new form of warfare. Poland relied on a large infantry and cavalry force, with limited modern armor and an air force vastly outnumbered and outclassed. Its mobilization, planned to unfold over 2 weeks, was disrupted from the first hour. Defensive strategy, honed in the Polish-Soviet War, assumed a more linear, slower-paced conflict and critically depended on the fulfillment of Allied guarantees from France and Britain. The Blitzkrieg shattered all these assumptions. Command and communication networks collapsed, leaving armies to fight in isolated pockets without strategic direction. The psychological impact was catastrophic. The speed of the advance, the constant, screeching air attacks, and the reality of encirclement shattered unit cohesion and civilian morale alike. Roads became clogged with terrified refugees, hampering military movements and creating scenes of humanitarian disaster. Cities like Wilen, bombed without military pretext at 4:40 a.m., and Warsaw were subjected to terror bombing, intended not just to support ground troops but to break the national will to resist. Within a week, the campaign was strategically decided. German forces reached the outskirts of Warsaw by September 8th. Then, on September 17th, the fatal blow fell. The Soviet Red Army invaded Poland from the east, acting on the secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact signed just weeks before. This was not an act of war against Germany but a cynical partition agreement between the two totalitarian powers. For Poland, it meant absolute strategic doom, caught in a vice between two invaders. Despite heroic and desperate resistance, such as the counterattack at the Bzura River, the defense of the Hel Peninsula, and the brutal siege of Warsaw where civilians joined soldiers, the outcome was inevitable. Warsaw surrendered on September 27th after sustained aerial and artillery bombardment. The last major Polish unit capitulated on October 6th. The military defeat in October 1939 was not the end, but the beginning of a far darker chapter, a brutal dual occupation. Germany and the USSR divided the country along a demarcation line. Western Poland, including the industrial heartland of Silesia and the corridor to the sea, was directly annexed into the Third Reich. Central Poland, including Warsaw and Krakow, became the general government, a Nazi colonial territory under the brutal administration of Hans Frank, intended as a dumping ground and labor reservoir for subhumans. The occupation regimes immediately launched campaigns of terror and extermination aimed at destroying Polish nationhood. In the German zone, the intelligence action and AB action targeted the Polish intelligentsia, clergy, and political elite for mass arrest and execution. The goal was to decapitate Polish society. Simultaneously, a policy of ethnic cleansing began, with hundreds of thousands of Poles forcibly expelled from annexed lands to make room for German settlers. Jews were immediately forced into ghettos. The Soviet occupation in the East was equally ruthless, characterized by mass deportations of class enemies. Officers, officials, landowners, and their families, to the gulags of Siberia and Kazakhstan. The infamous Katyn massacre, where the NKVD executed approximately 22,000 Polish military officers and intellectuals in 1940, symbolized the Soviet intent to erase Poland's leadership. Yet, the Polish state never formally surrendered. A government in exile was established first in Paris and then in London. At home, almost immediately, one of the largest and most complex resistance movements in occupied Europe, the Polish underground state Polskie Państwo Podziemne, began to form. It was a remarkable phenomenon, a clandestine network that included not only a military arm, the Home Army, Armia Krajowa, but also a complete underground judiciary, education system, press, and social services. It was a defiant assertion of continued national existence. The lessons of the Polish campaign echoed across the globe. For Germany, the success of the Blitzkrieg validated its military doctrine and emboldened Hitler for further aggression. The swift victory, however, also bred overconfidence and a belief in the inherent superiority of German arms, a misconception that would later prove fatal on the vast plains of the Soviet Union. For the Western Allies, particularly France and Britain, it was a terrifying wake-up call. They had declared war on September 3rd, but failed to launch any significant offensive in the West to relieve Poland, a period derisively called the Phony War. Their defensive, static mindset, embodied by the Maginot Line, was now glaringly obsolete. The Blitzkrieg template was refined and applied with even greater effect in the invasions of Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries, and France in 1940, leading to the catastrophic fall of France. The world watched in stunned disbelief as ancient nations fell in weeks. However, the limitations of Blitzkrieg began to show in the Battle of Britain, where air power alone could not achieve victory, and decisively in Operation Barbarossa in 1941, where vast distances, logistical overstretch, dogged Soviet resistance, and harsh weather ground the lightning war to a halt. For Poland, September 1939 was the opening act of a 6-year tragedy of unparalleled suffering. A nation that would lose approximately 6 million citizens, half of them Jewish victims of the Holocaust carried out on its soil. Its territory became the epicenter of Nazi genocide. The war ended with its liberation by the Red Army, which simply replaced one occupation with another, as it was forcibly incorporated into the Soviet sphere of influence for nearly 5 decades. Thus, the Blitzkrieg that began World War II not only destroyed Poland's independence in 1939, but also set in motion a chain of events that would deny it true sovereignty until 1989, making its wartime sacrifice one of the longest and most poignant of the conflict. The lightning strike of 1939 cast a shadow that lasted half a century.